And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session. It will be consisting of 3 talks and, of course, question and answer from the audience. I'd like to introduce Professor Craig Stark from the Center for Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, who will introduce the session and talk about today's features.
Oh, well, thank you, Jim, and thank you all for coming on out today. The session that we have today is going to really be talking about how can your brain actually change, and how do things like exercise and disorders actually affect the brain, and what might we be able to actually do to change this. So really the intersection of neuroscience and exercise and brain health and life. So the session is going to have 3 of us talking. I'm first going to talk a bit about what is plasticity? How much can your brain actually change as an adult? Then we're going to slide into Dr. Michael Yassa, who will be talking about effects of exercise on the brain, effects of disorders like depression on the brain, and then we'll slide into Dr. Stephen Small, who will be talking a lot about sports, about head injury, and about a number of other aspects of this. So, but to kick us off, I really wanted to give you an idea as to how much our brains can actually change as we're adults. Because a lot of us have this sort of image here in mind. So you've got the dogs here, you can try, but once they're past 40, you really can't teach them new tricks. So this is how a lot of us actually think about the brain. There's this development period. You're a baby, you're young, you're growing up, and you're changing and all that sort of thing. But at some point here, the idea is that things get stuck. And we have this picture as to how the brain works, that we've got 10 billion or so of these neurons interconnected in this vast, vast network here. They're firing off patterns of activity, and these patterns of activity are invoking new patterns of activity. And as this passes around in the brain, somehow this gives us. Everything that we're thinking, everything we remember, everything that we're feeling. And it's a dynamic place for certain. This activity is constantly changing, but many people think of all of these connections here between the neurons, the actual network itself, as I say, as being somewhat fixed. I mean, look, it's delicate. You have 10 billion neurons, you have a quadrillion or so connections, and somehow they have to get all wired up properly. And so once you have them wired up properly, why change them? It's an interesting kind of question, but it is something that as neuroscientists we've known for a long time, that we do in fact rewire our brain. In fact, it's one of the brain's greatest tricks and one of its greatest assets, because the fact that it's constantly rewiring itself lets us adapt and lets us change. And harnessing that power of change is really the secret to keeping it healthy, letting it repair, letting it rewire, and letting it tune itself up in new ways actually for you. So when I was starting in the neuroscience of memory, which is really what I do, when I was starting in that, we couldn't look at this directly. We could get some static pictures of things that we say is the brain in fact actually changing, but these days with modern methods, these are actual live pictures of brains changing. And you can see this little thing here? These little guys moving? This is a neuron, and these are its connections to other neurons. And over here, you can maybe make out a little bit of these things shooting out. Those are forming new connections to other neurons. And the things up here are the actual receptors where we have our synapses and everything connecting to other neurons. We can see these things actually change in the brain in real time. Now, it's a challenging thing to do. We don't typically do these things to people. These are actually slices with neurons in a dish here. But as I say, this is a very, very dynamic place. Now, this dynamics actually gives rise to learning. And what I'm going to try to convince you of today, and one of the things I hope you get out of today's section here, is that I can actually guarantee you are not going to leave this room with the same brain that you walked in with. I will absolutely guarantee that. In fact, it's already changed. And it's because of those pictures I can show this to you, but I can even say that because you're listening to my voice, the frequencies in my voice, you are actually getting a little bit better at being able to hear. Ever notice that sometimes, you're on a phone or something like this and it's a little difficult to understand the person, but after a couple minutes or so, it's fine? Or maybe somebody has an accent you don't initially get, but after a little bit of time with that person, it's just fine? It's just fine because your brain is changing. You're changing the way you're actually listening to the world. And one of the pioneers of this was Dr. Norm Weinberger, who's actually here on campus. He was one of the founding faculty members. Jim McGaw started the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior, and his first hire was Dr. Norm Weinberger. And some of his seminal work showed things like this. Okay, it doesn't look all that impressive right now. There are a couple peaks. What the heck are these things? Well, what this is if you stick a recording electrode into primary auditory cortex, so the first spot in the brain that's getting sound information out of your ear, the cortex at least, we find that there are neurons that fire a lot when there are certain frequencies. This one here happens to really, really like about 1,000 hertz. Boop, really, really likes that. Fires when there's that, and not so much if it's 1,500 or 2,000 hertz, and not so much if it's 500. But now take that same neuron and make a little bit higher frequency, beep, actually important. Have the animal learn something about that, and now that same neuron shifts and responds to this higher frequency. By making something important, you've changed the way the brain is actually processing sounds. And if we look across the rat cortex here, this color code is just coding the pitch. Low frequencies, boop. High frequencies, beep. Sorry, I can't get much higher than that. In any case, it's covering this whole spectrum. But again, you make then some frequencies, like the ones in yellow here, you make those important, and now you see there's a big expansion of how much the brain is actually using to represent that information. So just by listening to these tones and having them be important, fundamentally how the rat is actually hearing the world has changed. This is an adult rat. This isn't in development. And of course, this kind of thing happens in us as well. This is an early MRI study that I participated in which we showed people pictures of these dot patterns. And the basic idea is they sort of look a little bit like constellations, and what we actually did is inside here, they're all really related to each other. There's some underlying special prototype dot pattern, and we showed them various slight distortions of it, moving the dots around a little bit. The key thing was, after just seeing those for 30 minutes or so and seeing a couple hundred of these dot patterns, we then, as we're sitting them inside a big MRI machine and taking pictures of the activity in the brain, we're able to see that in earliest stages of visual cortex, this is called V1, first stage in the cortex of visual processing here, we can see that now we've actually changed the way the brain is processing these just by having seen them. They're processing ones that came from that same category differently than random dot patterns that folks hadn't seen anything about before. So we can start to see in this kind of thing that there are actual changes in how even our brains are seeing, are hearing. Again, why I can guarantee that you're going to walk out of here with a different brain. If you start to do things like you learn skills, we see that this actually can physically change the structure of the brain. So this study here looked at musicians, non-musicians, amateur musicians, and professional musicians, and took a look at the structure, the shape of the brain, and said, where is it that these people differ in terms of their brain? And what they found is that there were actual structural differences, size differences in a number of regions in the brain corresponding to things like detailed control of hand motor motions and processing of auditory stimuli. So we can see these kinds of things go on. We can see these sorts of differences. And the idea was that, maybe it's actually the fact that the musicians, the professionals, have played this a whole bunch. And that's actually why they have that. We can even see these kinds of things in interventional sorts of studies. This is one of my favorite ones. And it's one of my favorite ones because the first time I read it, I said, there's absolutely no way this is actually true. I was a hardcore skeptic of this. Because in this study, what they did is they took 60-year-olds and they said, we're going to teach them to juggle. And we're going to scan their brains before juggling, after they juggled for several months, and then tell them, please go home and don't juggle, and we'll scan your brain again. And they had another group in which they just scanned them, and there was no juggling involved. And they said, where in the brain are there any changes in the size and shape that we see in this juggling group? And what they found was this little tiny spot right here. It's a little tiny spot. I looked at that, I mean, come on, there are lots of spots you could have in the brain, and there are all sorts of things that could have been a problem with this study. But as I read the study more carefully, I then saw that, well, where is this spot? We know a bit about this spot. This spot is in an area that we call MT, and the only thing you really need to know about MT is that its neurons really, really love it when something is moving through the visual field at a certain speed and a certain angle. And that's what they respond to. And different neurons respond to different speeds and different angles there. And if you're learning to juggle and you're throwing something back and forth, your throws aren't perfect. You're learning to juggle. So you need to go, oh, wait a minute, it's over here. No, it's over there. And you need to be able to do this to be able to actually juggle. And that's the exact spot that they saw changing. I believed it in even more when they replicated the study and showed that you get the same exact spots coming up. So in all of this here, the first take-home message from my section here that I'd like you to have is your brain is plastic. It is changing with your experiences and with what you do in life. And that's key as we move through our lives here. You literally don't see or hear the world the same as you did when you entered this room. Okay, so that's one kind of thing, and it's something that I study a lot, having to do with plasticity in the brain and learning and memory. But in addition, there's one other kind of plasticity that we as adults actually have. We know that as you're developing as an infant, you're getting new neurons in the brain for a while, and then you're actually taking them away, and you're changing the wiring a lot. But even as adults, there are actually two spots in the brain where you are getting new neurons now. One of them is in the olfactory bulb, which helps you smell. We can talk about that later on. But the other one is in the structure called the hippocampus. And it's the structure that I actually study a whole bunch. And it's a structure we know is critically involved in learning and memory. And in fact, these bright green neurons here, this is a slice of the hippocampus, and all these things in bright green are brand new neurons that have been born into an adult. And the idea is that you use these perhaps to do all sorts of new learning. All right. So we know this thing, it's called adult neurogenesis, and you get new neurons. This idea that you're born with a fixed number of neurons and that's all you're ever going to have, for a lot of the brain that's true. But for places like the hippocampus here, that's not true, as you do get new neurons. Now these new neurons, we know there are a number of things that actually affect the new neurons. So one of the things that we know affects how many new neurons you get is exercise. It's a clear effect in the brain. So in this study here by von Prague out of Rusty Gage's lab, what you have is you stuck a little running wheel in a mouse's cage. And we could see what's the effect of that running wheel. And so here, this is again looking at that hippocampus, just sort of see this kind of like V, this sort of like bird delta shape here. And you can see here, these little black dots, okay, those are actually new neurons that have come in. In a control that doesn't have any access to a running wheel. Give them a new running wheel, oh, there are a whole bunch more. So exercise, we know, is promoting what we call neurogenesis, these new neurons coming into your brain, new neurons that we think are involved in you being able to learn new stuff in the world as you go around and as you explore, and somebody says, hi, my name's Bob, being able to have some prayer that his name is Bob, or even that you met that guy at that event. All right, maybe what you're actually learning, hopefully today, if you've exercised, if you have more neurons in your hippocampus here, you've got a bit better shot of being able to actually do that. And I know, as somebody who now is in that aging portion of the spectrum here, I want to keep as much neurogenesis as I can. So one of the things we know actually improves this is running. Another thing that we actually know improves this is what we call environmental enrichment, giving the rat something to do, somewhere to go, something to explore. We in fact see that that enrichment also boosts up neurogenesis. So in fact, if you give a rat a sort of a playground like this to run around and explore in, and then you do a really, really cool thing where you're actually constantly tracking, it's sort of like putting a little GPS monitor on the rat. Figuring out where the rat is going and exploring, the more the rat runs around and explores and experiences new things, the more he does that, the more new neurons actually the rat is getting. And so the more new neurons in the brain that would actually hope to let the rat learn new information, be a sort of more productive member of rat society, whatever that would actually mean. Okay, so take-home message number 2 for my talk, and then I'll open it up for a couple questions and pass it off here, is that in a key area of the brain here, in the hippocampus, it's key for learning and memory, there are new neurons in the brain. And this adult neurogenesis, it's reduced with age in various diseases, but it's elevated by exercise and by environmental enrichment. So we know then there are these ways in which you can be doing things, and exercise is critical to this to be able to actually be changing your brain as an adult. Okay, so with that, I will open it up to questions on this section. We'll just take a couple of those, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Yes, question over there in the stripes.
Can you share any studies with humans in addition to rats, or how that can correlate?
Yeah, so some of these studies actually are in humans. These neuroimaging ones are in humans, where we see that there are changes in your brain associated with things like learning to juggle or with being a musician. But that said, there are a lot of things we can't do in people. We're trying to figure out ways as neuroimagers to do things like measure the amount of neurogenesis inside the brain. And right now, we just don't have a good enough tool. But that's why researchers like the ones you have talking today try to have one foot at least in both of these worlds. So we can get a number of the factors out of the rodent literature and then see how well can they actually apply. So right now, in fact, my lab is doing work using big complex video games as a form of environmental enrichment. And in fact, we can see that your performance on memory tasks that are critically dependent upon the hippocampus, and we think maybe even dependent on neurogenesis, improves with the exploration in there. Other groups are now taking that same task, like Carl Kottman's group is taking that task and seeing what effect exercise actually has on that. So really it's this synergy that we can have between some of the things done in the animal and mapping it on the rodents, because you're absolutely right, we need to have that go both ways. But sometimes we can't get those direct measures in the humans, and so we try to look for nice analogous things passing back and forth. Other questions? Yes?
I was reading some statistic that if you are 60 today, you have a 50% chance of living 90 or more.
Okay.
There was a second statistic also that by the age of 85, 50% of the people will have Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So what can we do to be on the right side?
That is the ultimate question. What can we do? And hopefully with what we talk about today in the panel here, I mean, in some ways that's the ultimate question for the end of the panel. I mean, I'll tell you what I do. I don't take supplements. I mean, I can't not age. I know that's going on, and every 5 years past the age of 65, you've doubled the odds of getting Alzheimer's disease. So that by the time you're 85, as you mentioned, it's about a 50% chance that you'll eventually have Alzheimer's disease. What I do, I try to do the environmental enrichment, try to sort of lead this cognitively stimulated, engaged kind of lifestyle, and you know what else I do? I exercise. Because these are the things then that seem to have the big social network, have the sort of use it or lose it kind of thing, and exercise are two of the huge things that folks have found. It's like, okay, we can rest our hat on these right now. So I bike in and out of work every day, and that's one of the things.
How much of exercise weekly would be adequate?
Ah, that's the other fantastic question. The question was, how much exercise weekly? Could I give you a prescription? The answer is, I don't know. But nobody does yet, because these studies are not easy. For one thing, let me just sort of give you an idea as to why it is we don't have an answer yet, and a lot of that comes down to time. You know, when people study rodent models of Alzheimer's disease, I mean, a 2-year-old mouse is an old mouse. 2-year-old human's not. And if this is something like every 5 years, it has a doubling of the chance, but we don't want to start when somebody is already 85 and maybe even has Alzheimer's. We like to start at the earlier stages where we might have some early effect and slightly deflect it, and then therefore change the course of this person's life. But if I have the idea right now, let's say in my head, I have the idea that will completely stop Alzheimer's in its tracks. Let's say I have that. And I say, great, I need to now go actually try this and see if it works. So I've got to get some grant money to be able to actually go and try this. And that grant, I now have to wait to see, do they develop all, because it's not like, you know, today you don't have it and tomorrow, boom, you do. It takes time for this horrible disease to develop. And so 5 years, 10 years. So my great idea, to get any read on it, I may need 5 or 10 years to have any idea. We're trying to push that forward and trying to get it in a shorter amount of time. That's one of the things I know that Mike and I directly, and Mike even more so, work specifically on that. Can we see this delta quickly? But quickly is still measured in years. So then you refine your idea, you get a bigger trial, and then all of a sudden it's 10, 20 years or so down the line. So I don't have the answer just yet. The field doesn't, but this is also why we need continual research in this kind of thing. And what we have right now is a little bit leaning toward it. Talia, I'm going to take one more question. I'll try to make the answer quick, and then I'll pass it off. We'll have more time for other questions at the group discussion. Yes?
My question, I read somewhere that by using the hand or left that is not dominant can help build some
Yeah.
neurons. Is that true? Has there been a study to this effect?
So it's a great question. Using the hand that's not dominant. The evidence for that kind of thing is largely anecdotal. There's a little bit in the rat where we can actually draw this on, because it turns out rats are mostly right-pawed as well. Who knew? Sorry, lefties. But one of the ideas in the whole kind of use it or lose it that the field is really trying to work with and seems to have something to it is that you need to challenge yourself. So if what you're doing, if you've been doing the crossword puzzle in pen in 5 minutes every day for the last 20 years, doing crossword puzzles not doing anything for you anymore is our idea, our working hypothesis. Do something else, learn something new. So then that idea of do it with a non-dominant hand, sure, I don't think that's the magic pill, because if you decide, I want to learn the oboe, great. Do something that is engaging, that is challenging, that is like that sort of environmental enrichment, and make sure you also keep exercise associated with this as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to move any other questions and everything to the open discussion section, and I thank you all very much.